Page 256. Continuing. Good evening. Just as in battle, so in camp life, there is no time for discussion. A position as trustee becomes available, so you grab it. But years and decades have passed. We have survived our comrades, and our comrades have perished. To astounded free people and our indifferent heirs, we are beginning to disclose bit by bit the world of them and their, which had almost nothing human in it, and we must evaluate it in the light of the human conscience. And one of the principal moral questions here concerns the trustees. In choosing the hero of my story about the camps, I choose a slogger. And I could not have chosen anyone else, for only he could perceive the true interrelationships of camp life, just as it is only the infantryman who can weigh a whole war in the balance, though for some reason it is not he who writes the war memoirs. The choice of a hero and certain sharp remarks in my story perplexed and offended some former trustees, and as I have already said, 9/10 of the survivors are indeed trustees. Thereupon, Memoirs of a Trustee by Diakov appeared. Memoirs of survival, complacently confirming their resourcefulness in getting well fixed and cleverness in surviving and at any cost. And this is precisely the sort of book that should have appeared before my own. In those few short months when it seemed possible to discuss, a certain amount of debate flared up about the role of the trustees, and a certain general question was raised of the moral position of the trustee in camp. But in our country they do not permit any information to be x-rayed through and through, nor any discussion to encompass all the facets of a subject, and this is invariably suppressed at the very beginning, so no ray of light should fall on the naked body of truth. And then all this is piled up in one formless heap covering many years, where it languishes for whole decades, until all interest and all means of sorting out the rusty blocks from all this trash are lost. And so it was that all discussion of the trustees was dampened down at the very beginning and passed out of the pages of the public press into private letter. And the distinction between a trustee and a slogger in camp, though no sharper than that which existed in reality, had to be made, and it was very good that it was made right at the very birth of the camp theme in literature. But in the Lakshin's censored article in Novi Mir, there was a certain excessiveness of expression on the subject of camp labor, seeming to glorify that very thing which replaced machines and created us from the apes. And the generally correct direction of the article, and to a certain extent my own novella as well, were met with a counterwave of indignation, both from former trustees and from the never-imprisoned intellectual friends. What's going on here? Is slave labor being glorified? The cinder block laying scene in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich? What's going on here? Since when does earn your bread by the sweat of your brow mean do what the GULag chiefs want you to? We trustees are particularly proud that we avoided work and didn't drag out our existence at it. In answering these objections right now, I only regret that they will not be read for some time. In my opinion, it is unworthy of an intellectual to be proud of the fact that he didn't descend to physical slave labor, you see. you see, because he was able to get into office work. In this situation, the Russian intellectuals of the past century would have presumed to boast only if, at the same time, they could have liberated their younger brother from slave labor as well. After all, Ivan Denisovich didn't have it that way out, fixing himself up with an office job. So what should we do about our younger brother? Is it all right to let our younger brother drag out his existence at slave labor? Well, why not? After all, we've been letting him do it for long enough on the collective farms. We even fixed him up with it there. But if we let him do this, then maybe at least once in a while, for at least an hour or so on occasion, before knocking off, when the masonry work has gone well, we can let him take an interest in his work. We, after all, even in camp, find certain enjoyment in sliding the pen along the paper, in drawing a black line on tracing paper with a drawing pen. How could Ivan Denisovich get through 10 years if all he could do was curse his work day and night? After all, in that case, he would have had to hang himself on the first handy hook. And what, then, can one say about such an unlikely story as this Pavel Chupenyov, who had worked at logging for 7 years in a row, and at penalty camp at that, could hardly have survived and kept working if he had not had found meaning and interest in that logging. There is how he stood it, the camp chief who took interest in his few permanent workers, a surprising camp chief. In the first place, fed them belly full with gruel, and in the second place, permitted only his record-holding shock workers to work nights in the kitchen. This was their bonus. After a whole day of logging, Chupenyov went to wash and fill the food pots, stoke the oven, and clean potatoes until 2 a.m. And after he ate his fill, he went off to sleep for 3 hours without taking off his pea jacket. Once, also as a bonus, he was allowed to work for 1 month in the bread cutting room, and he rested up another month by self-mutilation. Because he was a record holder, no one suspected him. And that is all. But of course, explanations are required here too. In their work gang was a woman thief, a veteran bazaar swindler, who worked for a year as her dray woman, and she was living with 2 trusties at the same time, the weighing-in checker and the warehouse manager. As a result, their work game always overfulfilled its norm, and, more important, their horse, Gerchik, ate all the oats he wanted and hauled it well. Other horses were rationed according to the work gang's norm fulfillment. Oh, it's terrible. That's so terrible. I'm sick of saying, poor people. At least I can interject, poor horses. But nonetheless, 7 years on logging without interruption, it is almost a legend. But how could you work for 7 years if you didn't work well, if you didn't find some meaning in it, if you didn't become absorbed in the work? All they had to do, said Chupenyov, was to feed me, and I would have kept working and working. That's the Russian character. He mastered the technique of continuous felling in such a way that the first branch supported the trunk so it didn't sag and was easy to trim, and all the subsequent trunks were dropped atop one another, crisscrossed, so the branches fell neatly into 1 or 2 bonfires without having to be hauled away. You know how to pull a falling tree in exactly the required direction. And when he heard from the Lithuanians about Canadian lumberjacks who, for a wager, would put a stake in the ground and then drive it down into the ground with a falling tree, he was filled with enthusiasm. All right, we'll try the same thing, and it worked. I've never heard that as a Canadian. And that is how it turns out. Such is a man's nature, and that even bitter, detested work is sometimes performed with an incomprehensible, wild excitement. Having worked for 2 years with my hands, I encountered this strange phenomenon myself. Suddenly you become absorbed in the work itself, irrespective of whether it is slave labor, and it offers you nothing. I experienced those strange moments at bricklaying, otherwise I wouldn't have written about it. At foundry work, carpentry, even in the fervor of breaking up old pig iron with a sledge. And so surely we can allow Ivan Denisovich not to feel his inescapable labor as a terrible burden forever, not to hate it perpetually. Well, as I see it, they will yield on this point. They will yield to us, but with the obligatory condition that no reproaches should be implied for the trustees who never spent even a minute earning their daily bread by the sweat of their brow. Whether by the sweat of their brow or not, they at any rate carried out the commands of GULag bosses diligently, otherwise off to general work, and painstakingly used their special skills. After all the significant trustee positions were essential links in the camp administration and in camp production. These were precisely those specially forged skills links in the chain without which, if every last one of the Zeks had refused to accept trustee positions, the whole chain of exploitation would have broken, the entire camp system, because society outside could never have supplied such a quantity of highly skilled specialists who were willing, in addition, to live for years in conditions unfit for dogs. So why didn't they refuse? Why didn't they break the magic chain? The trustees' positions were key positions for exploitation. Norm setters or their bookkeeper helpers much less guilty. The construction superintendents, and were the technicians so guiltless themselves? What trustee position did not in fact involve playing up to the bosses and participating in the general system of compulsion? Was it only as cultural and educational section instructors, or as godfathers orderlies, who did the devil's work? And if N worked as a typist, solely as a typist, yet typed out requisitions for the administrative section of the camp, did this mean nothing? Let us think about that. And if she ran off copies of orders, this was not for the good of the Zeks. Let's suppose the security officer had no typist of his own. Then he himself had to type out his formal charges and the final version of denunciations of free persons and Zeks. He was going to imprison the next day. But you see, he could give this material to the typist, and she would type it up and keep silent without warning the endangered person. Yes, for that matter, would not a low-ranking trustee, the locksmith of the camp workshops, have to fill a requisition for handcuffs? Or strengthen the grids of iron bars in the punishment block? Or let us stay among written materials. What about the planner? Would not an innocent planner aid and abet planned exploitation? I do not understand. In which way was this intellectual slave labor purer and nobler than the physical slave labor? So it is not Ivan Denisovich's sweat that we should be getting most upset about, but the peaceful pen scratching in the camp office. For half my term, I myself worked as a sharashka, one of those islands of paradise. Oh, one of those sharashka, I think that's one of those specialists, right? Special scientists or something. We were torn away from the rest of the archipelago. We did not see its slave existence, but we were not exactly the same sort of trustees, and we did not, in the very broadest sense, by our scientific work, strengthen that same Ministry of Internal Affairs and the overall system of repression. And is not everything bad that goes on in the archipelago or on the entire earth accomplished through us? Yet we attacked Ivan Denisovich for laying bricks. more of our bricks are there than his. In camp, they more often expressed the contrary insults and reproaches that the trustees rode the sloggers' back, devoured their food, survived at their expense. These charges were made against the compound trustees in particular, frequently not without grounds, who short-weight Ivan Denisovich's bread, who stole his sugar by dampening it with water, who kept fat meats or good cereals from the common pot. Those camp compound trustees on whom food and clothing depended were chosen on a special basis. To get those positions, impudence, slyness, bribery were required. To hold such jobs, ruthlessness and a deaf ear to conscience were required, and, in most cases, to be a stool pigeon as well. Of course, all generalizations overstate their case, and from my own recollections, I can undertake to name opposite examples of corrupted, honest compound trustees, but they didn't last long at their posts. As far as the bulk of well-fixed camp compound trustees are concerned, however, one can say without fear of being wrong that on the average more depravity and malice were concentrated among them than the average native population. It was not a matter of chance that these were the very jobs the camp bosses gave to their former cronies, imprisoned former security people. When the MVD of Shakti district was imprisoned, he wasn't set to come to cut timber, but popped up as a work assigner at the headquarters camp of GULag. And when MVD man Boris Guganava was imprisoned, because I once took a cross off a church, I have never since known happiness in my life. He would be the manager of the camp kitchen at Rishoti Station. But another seemingly quite different breed latched onto this group too, the Russian interrogator from Krasnodar, who, under the Germans, had conducted the case against the Young Guard partisans, was an honored work assigner in one of the divisions of GULag. Sasha Sidorenko, a former intelligence agent who had fallen into German hands right off, and who had gone off to work for them. And who had gone off to work for them right off, was now storeroom manager in Kangu, and loved getting back at the Germans for his own fate. Hardly had they gone to sleep after roll call, tired from the day's work, and he would come to them pretending to be drunk and raise a heart-rending cry, "Germans, Achoo, I'm your God, sing to me." And the frightened Germans, rising up in their bunks, half asleep, began to sing Lily Marlene for him. And what kind of people were those bookkeepers who released Bolshevik from camp in late autumn wearing just his shirt? Or that shoemaker in Bruropolem who, without even a twinge of remorse, took Anne Bernstein's new army boots in return for a bread ration. When they got together on their porch for a friendly smoke and to chat about camp affairs, it was hard to picture just who among them might be different. True, they too have something to say. In justification of themselves, for example, I.F. Lipai wrote a passionate letter. Quote, "The prisoner's ration was outrageously and pitilessly plundered on all sides. The thievery of the trustees, for their own sake, was petty thievery, while those trustees who engaged in large-scale thievery were forced into it. The administration officials, both free workers and prisoners, particularly during wartime, squeezed the paw of division officials, and the division officials did the same to the camp officials, and the latter did the same to the storeroom and kitchen personnel, and all at the expense of the sex ration." The most fearful sharks of all were not the trustees, but the non-prisoner chiefs Kuregin, Poisyushapka, Ignatchenko from Sevdinlag. They did not just steal, but removed from the storerooms, and not just by the pound, but in sacks and barrels. And again, it wasn't only for themselves. They had to divvy it up, and the trustees had somehow to cover all this up and forge the records. And anyone who refused to do it was not only sacked from his job, but sent to a penalty or strict regimen camp. And so the trustee staffs, by the will of the chiefs, were riddled with cowards afraid of physical work and scoundrels and thieves. And the only ones ever prosecuted were the storekeepers and bookkeepers, while the chiefs kept out of it all. After all, it wasn't they who signed the receipts, and the interrogators considered it a provocation for storekeepers to testify against bosses. Crazy. The picture is quite vertical. It so fell out that a woman of my acquaintance, Natalia Milevna Anichkova, who was honest in the extreme, was once assigned to manage the camp bakery. At the very beginning, she ascertained that it was customary to send a certain amount of baked bread from the prisoners' bread rations outside the camp compound daily, without any documents, of course, in return for which the bakers received a small amount of preserves and butter from the shop for the free employees. She forbade this system, stopped the bread from leaving the camp compound, and immediately the bread began to turn out underbaked or rock hard. And then the batch would be late, this from the bakers, and then they began to withhold flour from the warehouse, and the camp chief, he had been getting more out of this than anyone, refused a horse to fetch and deliver. Anichkova struggled for so many days and then surrendered. And at once, the work went smoothly again. Even if a compound trustee was able to keep out of this universal thievery, it was nonetheless nearly impossible for him to desist from using his privileged position to get himself other benefits, such as rest point out of turn, hospital food, the best clothing, bed linen, or the best place in the barracks. I do not know and cannot picture a trustee so saintly that he never grabbed at least a tiny bit of something for himself, for all those benefits strewn about. And his fellow trustees would have been afraid of him. They would have forced him out. Everyone even thought indirectly or in a roundabout way, even though almost not knowing, nonetheless made use of these benefits, and in some degree lived off the sloggers. It is hard, very hard, for a compound trustee to have an unsullied conscience. And then there is another question about the means which, when he got his position, very rarely was it a clear-cut question of qualifications as for a physician or for many work trustees. The unobjectionable path was to be an invalid, but frequently it was the protection of the godfather. Of course, there were apparently neutral ways to get there. People got positions because of old prison connections, or thanks to collective group support, often based on ties of nationality. Certain of the smaller nationalities were successful at this and used traditionally to cluster in trustee jobs, and then the communists used to help each other out privately. And there was another question too. When you were raised up, how did you conduct yourself toward the rest, toward the common herd? How much arrogance was here? How much rudeness? How much forgetfulness that we are all natives, and our power was transient? And finally, the highest question of all, if you were in no way harmful to your brother prisoners, were you at least in any way useful to them? Did you ever use your position, even once, to defend their general welfare, or only and always on your own? As far as the work trustees were concerned, it would be quite unjust to accuse them of eating the sloggers' food or riding on their backs. The sloggers weren't paid for their labor. True, but not because they fed the trustees. The trustees weren't paid for their work either. Everything went to the same abyss. But the other moral doubts still remain. The virtual inevitability of exploiting advantages in living conditions, the not always clean ways of getting the right assignment, arrogance, and then always that same question at the top. What did you do for the general good? Anything at all? Ever? Yet, there were some who could, like Vasily Vlasov, look back on deeds on behalf of the universal good. Yes, such clear-headed, smart fellows who managed to get around the arbitrary camp rules, who helped to organize the common life, so not all would die, and so as to deceive both the trust and the camp. Those heroes of the archipelago, who understood their duty not in terms of feeding their own persons, but as a burden and an obligation to the whole prison herd. The tongue simply cannot be twisted to call such as these trustees. And most came from the engineers, and glory to them. But for the rest, no glory. There's no reason to put them on a pedestal, and there is also no reason for the former trustees to be contemptuous of Ivan Denisovich because they succeeded in sidestepping all kinds of slave labor and did not lay bricks by the sweat of their brow. Nor is it worth arguing that we intellectuals spend twice as much energy on general work, on the work itself, and then by a sort of psychic combustion on all the mental activity and suffering which we simply cannot stop, and as a result of which it is fair for us to avoid general work and let cruder types slog away. It is still not clear whether we do, in fact, expend twice as much energy. Yes, in order to abstain from coming out to some sort of an arrangement in camp and let the force of gravity take over and drag you down to the bottom, one must have a very stable soul, a very illuminated consciousness, a large part of one's term behind one, and probably, in addition, regular parcels from home. Otherwise, it is straight suicide. As the gratefully guilty old camp veteran D.S.L. put it, I am alive today. That means someone else was on the list for execution in my place that night. If I am alive today, it means that someone else suffocated in the lower hold in my place. If I am alive today, it means that I got those extra 7 ounces of bread which the dying man went without. All this is written, not in reproach. The basic viewpoint of this book has already been set forth and will be held until the end. All who suffered, all who were squeezed, all who were forced to make a cruel choice ought rather to be vindicated than accused. The more correct thing will be to vindicate them. But in forgiving oneself the choice between dying and being saved, do not forgetfully cast a stone at the one whose choice was even harder. We have already met such people in this book, and there will be more. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a good day.